Imagine a poet, a painter, a musician. Her eyes close, his mind drifts away. A holy light, a golden beam comes down from heaven, as if each was the Son of God himself at his baptism, and along with that light comes a dove and a voice of God from heaven. We have a view of artistic people that a muse speaks through them in some way. And though there is a certain transcendence that seems to come with creating, I have found being creative is much more often forcing oneself to make something, or to make anything. And the hundreds of hours you put in bring about 10 useful hours of a product. It seems to me that those who create search for so long to create something, and they eventually find something because of that searching. Excellence isn't a single act, but countless, and creativity is a habit. My name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good. Welcome to How to Write Good, the writing podcast that is not about how to write. My name is Daniel Poppy, your host. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. If you haven't already, please follow How to Write Good on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you would like to stay up to date with both How to Write Good and everything I am working on, please sign up for my email list. You can find that at my website as well. Again, that's danielpoppy.com. All right, besides all that stuff, check out my serialized podcast, serialized book, serialized podcast story, whatever you want to call it. It is called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. It is the second 2 chapters came out. I have 2 chapters coming out this month because they are the same. They're essentially the same chapter, but it was too long to put as one, so I split it up into 2, so you get 2 this month. And then next month, and every single month after this, there should be 1 coming out unless there is a reason to have 2, like there was with this month. I noticed I was listening to another podcast that's serialized, that's a story. It's essentially a novel in podcast form. And I noticed that it was hard to follow when you didn't have a narrative break, when it went from one podcast episode to the other, and there was no difference. You have to, for whatever reason, your mind doesn't hold it in, doesn't remember it as easily. I think that when you have a narrative break where you're like, okay, this part of the story is done, I kind of remember everything that happened, it's easier to remember, but if you're in the middle of action, it's a little more difficult. So check that out. If you don't like listening to this podcast, if you ran into this podcast out of whatever reason, I don't know why you're listening right now. If you did, you can always check that out at its own feed. It's One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. You can put it into any podcasting device that you have and it'll pop up. And I would suggest that you do that. I don't know why you're here. You do have to listen to my voice with that podcast, but you don't have to listen to my ideas. Just kidding, you do, because I wrote it. All right, the word of the week is widdershins, and widdershins means something that is moving counterclockwise or in the wrong direction. So you can use that as very English to me. It sounds like a very English word from the 19th century, aka the 1800s. But hopefully that is something that you can incorporate into your regular daily life, and people will look at you funny because nobody uses that word. Hopefully you can incorporate it into your writing, and then when people read it, they'll think you are, what's the word? I can't remember the word right now. They'll think you're a little full of yourself for using that word, unless you have an English speaker saying it. Then they won't care, because they get away with that stuff. They get away with saying weird stuff. They're a weird country, England. But we are in the tradition of the English country, because we're in the United States, and we're Anglophones, and we take our law and traditions from their law, actually, like the Magna Carta and stuff like that. So we're going to jump into our accidental lessons for this week. I'm really tired. I'm not tired in like a bad way. You know when you wake up and you just kind of feel, there's different types of tired. There's like body tired where your whole entire body's just dragging. I'm like head tired when you get sick and you kind of feel like you're in a fog. So I kind of feel like I'm in a fog. I already had 2 cups of coffee today, so I'm probably talking faster than I usually do, but I'm still tired. I just can't get out of this. The rule, we're jumping on to rule number 12. So this is almost done. For those of you who are just here for the rules, I'm going to get to them. I get sick of doing them constantly, so that's why I'm kind of changing it up right now. Rule number 12 is creativity is a habit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about creativity, and if you listened last week, this kind of everything connects, honestly. Everything connects together, but this connects to last week. I was actually just thinking about this when I decided to do it. Last week I talked about this idea how, if you didn't listen to it, because some of you may have not, or just to remind you, how we put people who are creative or people who do these big things on pedestals when they're actually just human. And we should see, okay, there's more similarities about that person to myself than there are differences. I just want to do a quick caveat with stuff like this. I don't think everybody is capable of doing everything everyone else is capable of doing. First of all, just to clarify that, first of all, you don't have the time to do everything everybody else is doing. Second of all, you may not have the ability or just the capacity. For example, if you don't have, well, this is a little different. If you don't have legs, and this is changing today, if you don't have legs, you're probably not going to be the best sprinter in the world, right? It's unlikely, maybe because of technology that's going to change, but if you don't have certain limbs, you're not going to be able to do certain things. And I think that people without limbs, people who are missing like a leg or an arm, or missing both, or are born without any arms or legs, because that happens, they actually do show us that you are capable of a lot more than you would expect them to be, right? I have 2 arms and 2 legs, so I don't live like that, but I know there's one guy who was born without arms and legs, and he actually goes out and does speaking stuff, and he can swim, and he can do all these different things because he just learned how to adapt. So I think that they are showing that they can do a lot more, but he's never going to be an Olympic class sprinter. He's never going to be as fast as Usain Bolt, probably, right? Technology might change that, but there's other things, like you may not be as smart as someone else. You may not be as good at someone else's something. For me, I'm really bad at math. Now, could I get really good at math? Probably. I could probably get fairly good at math if I took the time to do it. But do I have the time to get really good at high-level math? And for me, I'm thinking, I don't really have the time to do that. So I think that there are you can't do everything, and you're not capable of everything. I'm never going to be a world-class athlete. Now, is there a possibility that I could have been if I really put my mind to it? Maybe. At the same time, I don't want to, and at the same time, I don't have the time to do it. You have to sacrifice certain things to do other things. And this isn't technically related to what we're talking about today. Maybe it is. But at the same time, if you think, I'm not capable of doing this, right? If it's like, I'm not good enough of a writer, or maybe you're a musician, you're like, I'm not good enough of a musician. Well, you don't really know that until you actually try in a lot of cases. And I think that there is more dignity in saying, okay, I'm going to do my own thing. Like, I'm going to live somewhat of a normal life. I'm going to get a job so I can take care of myself and take care of my family. I think that you need to do that if you're in a position where it's your responsibility, right? I think that's your primary duty, actually. But I think beyond that, you owe it to yourself. I don't know if you owe it to yourself, but I think that you should try to meet your highest potential. I don't think you should sacrifice relationships. I don't think you should sacrifice what you need to do for other people in your life. But I think you should try to reach your highest potential. If you have a dream to do something, the worst thing that could happen with that dream is that you fail. And then you'll just have to start and you'll live a normal life. And I've said this in the past, but I just want to say it again. So I don't think everybody is capable of doing everything else everybody is doing for various reasons. But at the same time, if you're listening to this, it's likely that you are interested in writing or interested in doing something creative. And I say just try to do it. Even if it takes you 15 years to get a lot of stuff out where people start to know that you do it. At least try to do it and keep on doing it until you see whether or not you're going to fail. Because the worst thing that can happen is failing isn't the big, you're not failing in a big way, honestly. If you were a surgeon and you were going to fail in a surgery, that is a big way to fail. If you were someone in a really high stress job and you're failing, it's a big, huge way to fail. But if you're doing something creative and you have another job that supports you and you fail in creativity, it's not really making you fail. You're not failing in a huge, you're not crashing and burning in a huge way, right? Your life isn't going to fall apart if you fail in that way. You'll probably just get embarrassed, and you'll probably get a little bit more humbled, and you'll probably understand yourself a bit more. So I'm just encouraging you, if you're listening to this, why not try it, right? Instead of thinking, I need to do this and I need to be able to be world famous in writing or music or painting or whatever you do, instead of thinking of it that way, think, okay, so I'm going to do this, and this is something that I really love. I think you should approach it from an area of love, and you should approach it in that way. I'm going to do this. I love this so much. I want to do this. Instead of getting discouraged, think, okay, if I just do this as a hobby and I put stuff out there and I take this hobby seriously enough that I'm trying to put something out there professional, then I'm going to maybe in 15 years, give yourself a long timeline, because then if you keep on working at it, I think you're going to be surprised. And you maybe you fail, maybe you find you actually don't like doing it, and I think that's a good thing as well, because I think you should try stuff. But we're getting into the rule for this week. So the rule for this week, and I'm sorry I went off on a sidebar there, but I think it's just something that's been on my mind, and I just want to share with everybody who's listening. And I think that everybody can apply that to their life in some way. And in the same way, I think that everyone can apply this rule to their life in some way. So there's this idea of creativity. I guess it does relate to that. There's this idea of creativity that people have this innate ability to be creative. And I think that, yes, people have an innate ability to be creative, and that includes pretty much everybody in the entire population of the world. There's very few people who do not have the capacity to be creative in some way. And there's varying levels of creativity, because creativity is approaching something and reacting to it in a unique way, right? So you're taking all the information you have and you're reacting or using that information in a unique way. And the majority of people in the world have the ability to do that in some capacity. If you're living your life and you see a situation and you're like, okay, what do I need to do in this situation? It's likely that you have some capacity to be creative. Even people who aren't that creative or who aren't big critical thinkers, they still react to things in their life. They're still taking in information. They're still reacting to it in a way that's novel. I think that people who, if you're intellectually lazy, you tend to not be as creative, because you eventually get into your habits of doing things and you just live out a habit, which I think is actually it's a kind of a paradox with creativity, but creativity seems to be the opposite of habit. I don't think it's the opposite of habit. I think it's something you develop. So it seems like people have this. There's individual people who are specially gifted to be creative. All right. And I think that, okay, everybody's creative, but there are people who are more creative than others for whatever reason. Now, in the past, there was this view of creativity, and I think that people who are more religious would probably still have this view of creativity. In the past, there was this view of creativity that a muse came down to you. You were touched by the muse, or the muse spoke to you, and you were able to create something based on what the muse is doing. And the reason why people thought this way is because when you create something, it almost seems like you're not doing it yourself, or you're swept up in something that's greater than yourself. You're getting to something transcendent, right? So this is where we get to kind of artistic type things, which is, if you think about art in the modern era, if you think about art from I'm not sure what time period, but if you think about stuff in the 1900s, especially in the 70s, you think about Andy Warhol, which, if you like Andy Warhol, I'm not the biggest fan of him, but I don't think he was swept up in some type of transcendent thing. I think he was kind of looking at very mundane things in life, and he was deviating from more of a transcendent view of art, because he made soup cans. Come on, people. So maybe he was. I'm not going to judge whether. I'm going to say that I think he wasn't. So I guess I am judging whether he was or not. But it's possible that he was. It was a transcendent experience. But throughout history, the majority of times, people have been making art because they did have this view. They understood that there was something going on that was kind of beyond them, which I think is kind of cool. So I'm going to touch on that quick. So art is cool. Art is making something creative and being in the creative process, especially like a good creative process. If you have that burst of inspiration, it's something that you can't fully understand as a human. I think that people have tried to understand. I think that people have looked at it scientifically and tried to pinpoint what is going on exactly, maybe in the brain chemistry, but when you actually get down to the experience of it, because if you look at the brain chemistry and say, this is what is happening, sure, you can do that, right? You say, oh, this is what's happening in the brain. This is what is causing this. Maybe it's causing it. Maybe it's not, whatever. this is what's causing it, which brain science, the brain is so complex. I think that we'll probably figure out that things work differently than we think they do. I think we have a very rudimentary understanding right now. But if we say, oh, this is what's causing it, there is also the experience that goes with it. And when you try to figure out why this is happening through the experience, then you get to the point where you're like, well, I'm not exactly sure. And in the past, it was the muse. And I think if you're religious, you think that there is some spark of the divine. The Christian tradition has this idea that humans, God breathed into humans and brought about humanity through his own breath, which if you kind of look at how Christians view stuff, they view it as, I think they view creativity as this image of God. You bear the image of God, therefore you're able to create something, and you're following after that. You actually, I had a professor who said, oh, we are humans are procreators. Now, procreation is this idea of having children, but he also kind of extended it to this idea that you are also creating after God, essentially. So you can think of it like that. Some people, I think, probably think that this and I think that's where people think that transcendence comes from in this modern day. And most people, I think, would say, oh yeah, maybe that's the case. Maybe that's what's going on if you actually explained it to them and you asked them about it. And then if you take it from the atheistic view, I think that you view it as this is chemicals going on in your brain, and therefore it's creating this response that feels transcendent because it's meeting some need, and because it's meeting some need in your life, it is releasing endorphins and therefore making you feel really good and make you feel really transcendent. So you can kind of get to the same type of of experience by taking drugs. I would expect. I haven't taken drugs where I've gotten to a similar experience, but I think that they're analogous in some ways. And if you take a lot of drugs or mind-altering drugs, you can certainly tell me that I'm wrong. But that's why people who are creative take drugs, because they think it opens up their minds in some way that they weren't capable. They weren't capable of opening up their minds in that way before. Okay. So that's my little spiel about that. But I think that if you think, oh, I'm not a very creative person, I think that you can actually develop a habit of creativity. I think that this transcendence that we experience meets this very mundane brain science, because I think brain science is fascinating. I think it's very mundane, and I use that word in meaning that it's very material, I guess. I'm probably using it a little incorrectly, but I think that if you understand it from that perspective, you kind of get what I'm trying to say. It's something very basic. It's something very earthly, I guess. Very earthly. It's something that we can see, we can touch, we can feel. It's a mundane thing. Okay. So if you bring those together, you think, okay, is there a possibility that this is a pattern that is going on in my brain that allows me to do this? And I think that whatever you think about brain science, I think that I think the human brain is extremely plastic, and I think that science shows us that the human brain is extremely plastic, meaning malleable. It can change. You can change your brain in a lot of different ways. There are certain things that I think you have a really hard time changing. For example, if you're female, you actually have a bigger emotional center to your brain. I think women experience more neuroticism, and neuroticism, if you aren't aware of what that is, it's negative emotion. I think women experience negative emotion. I think that's what studies show. I don't know that off the top of my head. I'll see if I can find that. But so there's differences in brains, and women have the capacity. And I always do this. Women have the capacity to understand social situations better as a general rule, right? Men are more focused on objects, and they're more driven by, I don't know if you'd say data, but more material things that are more mechanical. And that's usually the case. That's generally the case, and there's always variations with it. So there's differences in the brain between those things. And then there's also differences in if you have, depending on like mental illness and different things like that, IQ, that's going to be partially due to the ability to process. I think a lot of IQ is just your ability to process information. That's a lot of what it is, which is very helpful if you're thinking about things, right? And when it's taking in, it's memorizing, it's different things like that. With creativity, I think that it's more useful to understand creativity from the perspective of a habit. So when I look at creativity, I think there's certainly times when I feel it's a transcendent experience when I write, right? Because that's what I do. And I think that musicians especially feel a transcendent experience when they're making music and they're playing music. And I think that when you're caught up, if you're a musician who's really big and you're in a concert, that becomes I think it gets close to a religious experience. I think it doesn't stay a religious experience, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think when you're a musician and you're just starting out, I think that the struggle is in a way somewhat religious. It reflects this almost spiritual experience. And I think people who are musicians who are trying to get into the musical world, they're struggling, and it's not a goal. Well, it is a goal, but it's almost bringing meaning to their lives. And then when you hit it big, then you have all these people who love what you do and they support you, and then because of that, you connect to them in this social way, and because of that social way, you're connecting to them where they're like, "Oh, I love your music." It's almost like you're swept up in this emotional high, which I think that having an emotional high is, it feels like a very spiritual experience. You're like, "Wow, I can't believe this. I feel a part of something bigger. I feel like I'm doing something I'm supposed to." And I think that when people say, "Oh, I really like your book," or "I really like how you write," or they point out something that I do, I think it brings a similar feeling to me. And I'm like, "Oh, wow, I'm actually doing something that's right. I'm actually doing something that's connecting to people," because the social aspect of living as a human is really important. And being able to connect to someone on a personal level, on a emotional level, is something that is really fulfilling in humans. Now, I would say that's probably connected to this idea that the Christian idea of humans being made in the image of God. Therefore, we are connecting to someone who is made in the image of God. Therefore, we are experiencing something of the divine. You can totally disagree with me on that. That's my viewpoint on it. Take it or leave it. But I think that that's what's going on. The issue is that high doesn't last. So when you are someone who makes art in some capacity and you get all this adulation from people who love your art, eventually you realize that that's not fulfilling. And that's why there's so many people who are musicians, so many people who are actors or do any type of art who kill themselves. I don't know if they're overly represented. I don't know if creative people or people doing all this art or people who are on the top of the creative field are killing themselves more, but it's certainly the case that it doesn't fulfill you completely, because if someone was fulfilled completely, they wouldn't kill themselves. Himself, herself. So when you get to a certain point, you can't be carried by the spiritual feeling. And I think this goes along with any religious type of thing too. When you get to a certain point in your if you are a religious person, when you get into a certain point with your spiritual life, you can't be carried just by the emotions of your spiritual life. And I think that's something everybody has to learn. And I think it extends to life in general. When you get to a certain point in your relationships, you can't just let the emotions of your relationship carry you through that relationship. It doesn't work that way. There's so much more to the human experience, and most of what is in the human experience is actually not because you are on this emotional high. Most of what is in this human experience is because you're deciding to do things, and you're doing things despite your emotions. Actually, I think your emotions can be a good barometer of different of how to do stuff, or it can be a good barometer of if you're like disgusted at something. That may be a good cue at the same that something is wrong if you're disgusted at something. But I think at the same time, if your emotions can be wrong, and if you are afraid of everything, your emotions are almost always wrong. Right? They're wrong in almost all cases, and then you have to actually fight against that. So in your daily life, in your regular life, if you get married or if you date somebody, you think, "Oh, this person is awesome," right? And you're swept up in this amazing feeling, which is almost spiritual. It's similar to creating art, right? And then eventually it dulls, right? Your brain doesn't continue to say, "Oh, this person is amazing. They're fulfilling everything inside of me. Every lacking thing inside of me is fulfilled by this person." It eventually fades, and then you don't know what to do. Well, most people realize that, okay, I'm going to commit to this person. I'm going to make a decision to actually care about this person and be with them. And that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where you actually it's your how you view that person and how you interact with them changes if you actually make that decision. And then it actually, I think, is better in the long run. And I think that's the same thing with writing. If you are someone who's young, and I think that most people who listen to this podcast are probably around my age, so maybe this will be applicable to you as well, or maybe you're just realizing this, but I think most people who are young, they get caught up in this emotional side of things, which makes sense because people who are 21 and younger, I think they, first of all, they have had a fairly easy life if they live in the United States. I think the majority of people who are probably listening to this, if you really looked at your life and you really looked at the issues in your life, I would think you would have fairly small issues. I think I have, there's things that I look at in my life that I think, okay, those are pretty big, right? Those are things that were pretty bad and that they were difficult to go through, really difficult. But at the same time, if I look at them in the grand scheme of human suffering, I see that they're not huge, right? And I think that there's some people who are maybe listening who have had really bad things happen, and I'm not discounting that, but at the same time, I think the majority of people I've met, even if they have a fairly rough childhood or a fairly rough life, or if something bad happens, like if you have the loss of a loved one or something like that, there are much worse things that can happen in your life. So if you're someone who has had really bad things, I'm not saying that it's not difficult. But if we look at our lives, I think the majority of people are caught up in this emotional thing because they haven't had very difficult things to deal with. And I think that we're actually being lied to as well. I think that my generation has been lied to that if it doesn't feel good, you shouldn't be doing it. I think that we direct ourselves according to our emotions too much. And if we just directed ourselves according to what we believe is true, it actually changed things for us. Because if you direct yourself according to your emotions, if your emotions say it's bad, it's bad. But if you direct yourself according to truth, then if the truth says it's bad, it's bad. And it kind of gets into your actual, what decisions you make as well. So if you run into something that's hard and you're going from an emotional perspective, then you're going to be like, well, this is hard, therefore I shouldn't do it. I don't know. If it's going to be hard, it's not going to be good. If you run into something hard from a perspective of truth, like you say, okay, I should be doing this. This is something that is correct to do. It's something that if I do it, it's going to be better in my life, but it's a very difficult thing. You're going to say, well, this is going to be better if I do this, or this is what I'm supposed to do, right? If this is something that is good to do, you're going to do that despite it being hard. And I think that it gets easier, right? I think that if you ever learn a skill, the skill is really difficult at first, and eventually you get used to doing that skill and you get better at it. There's a saying that people, when there's this trope. I think it's a trope in movies where they're like, oh, somebody died, and they're like, oh, does it ever get any easier? Or something related to that. Maybe something bad happened. And then the person asks, no, it doesn't get any easier, but you get better. And I think that's the same thing in most things in life. It doesn't get any easier to go through life. You just get better. It's not easier to have kids. You just get better as a person. And I think you don't get perfected as a person, but I think you do get better at certain things. And I think you should strive to get better at certain things. And and then I have 4 minutes to talk about creativity as a habit. It's the same thing with creativity. Right? You can apply everything I've talked about to creativity, or maybe not absolutely everything, but the general premise and the general thing I've been talking about. If you base your creativity off of the feeling of transcendence, if you base your creativity off of the emotional high, if you base your creativity off of feeling the spiritual high of creating something, or if you base it off of this idea that, oh, this is amazing, I love it so much, I'm having so much fun, then I think you are going to have a rough time getting anything done as a creative person. What you need to do is you need to make creating things a habit in your life. Now, you can do this in multiple different ways. One of the easiest ways I would suggest to do it is block a specific amount of time off. It doesn't have to be every single day. People always say, oh, if you're a writer, you have to write every single day. I don't think that's the case. I think that you actually have to just write habitually. And it can be every single day. I think it's good to do it every single day, but I think it could be once a week. You could just write every Saturday, right? So I think that one way to make creativity a habit, as opposed to just doing it when you feel like doing it, is to block off a specific amount of time a day. Maybe it's 15 minutes, maybe it's a half an hour, maybe it's an hour if you have that ability. That'd be awesome. And you just do it, right? You sit down and that's all you do. You put your phone away, you turn your phone off maybe, you put it away from you, you put it upstairs, you put it in a different room. You make sure that you're not being bugged by anyone, you say, hey, I want this time to create something. If you have kids, then you say, hey, I want 15 minutes where I'm not being interrupted, which might be really hard, right? And if you want to listen to music, whatever you need to do, you sit there and you write. In my case, you write. Maybe you make music. You take that amount of time and you only devote that time to doing one thing, and that's your creative pursuit. That's one way to do it. Now, some people may be like, well, I try to do that, and it's really, really hard. I think the secret in doing this is just if you're a writer, I think writers run into writer's block a lot because you're trying to be good at what you do. Have fun. Instead of trying to make something awesome, just have fun with what you're doing. Write whatever you want. Some people, I think, do better with writing prompts. Maybe find some writing prompts. Or you could just you could write whatever you're thinking. What actually works for a writer, or at least for me, maybe it won't work for you. If you're having writer's block, well, you are thinking something, right? And you're thinking about your writer's block. You're thinking about how hard it is. So why don't you use that as a jumping off point? You have an emotion going on inside of you. And when you have an emotion, it's really good to use that emotion in your writing because it makes your writing flow. So if you're stuck and you're having writer's block in some way, use the emotion, connect to the writer's block, and use the thoughts about the writer's block itself, and then write about the writer's block. Because at least you're writing. Now, eventually what happens when you are putting a specific time, or you're blocking off specific time where you're doing this one creative act, is that you get used to doing it and you get better at doing it. So that is one way to do it. You block something off and then you use it. If you're someone who goes into writing and you have all these thoughts spinning in your head, this is related to writer's block too. Because writer's block is just this thought that it's stuck in your head that you can't write or you're not good enough or whatever. But if you have all these thoughts spinning in your head about the worries of the day, just write about the worries of the day. You don't have to write a best-selling novel. You don't even have to be good. You don't have to write in story form. You can write a poem. You can write in nonfiction, whatever it is. You can write something completely fiction too about your situation as well. So that's what I would suggest. Another way to do this is you create a ritual of writing. And what I mean by that is you have a specific thing you do to get into the writing mindset. And this is a little more difficult. But I would suggest that maybe pair them together so that when you start, so that you can write anytime you want, or you can create something at any point you want. For me, I don't have a set time that I write. So you may say I'm a hypocrite, but I do have a ritual that I do when I start to write. And it often is listening to music. So I listen to music and I just take time to sit back and relax, and I don't worry about writing at first. I kind of daydream, actually. And I think I've talked about this in the past. What I do is I daydream. I let my mind drift to the thoughts I want to talk about, and it's kind of like lucid dreaming. So if you're not aware of what lucid dreaming is, it's where you're controlling your dreams while you're asleep. I can't do it. I can't lucid dream. I actually wake up if I'm trying to lucid dream. But that's what lucid dreaming is. You're controlling your dreams while you sleep. So people who lucid dream, they are like, oh, I like to fly in my dreams. Well, I realize I'm sleeping when I do that. But what I do is I just let my mind drift off, and I kind of direct it a little bit, but I kind of let it drift off into my story, what I'm trying to write. And I found this to be really useful. So the first part of my writing isn't writing at all. It's just prepping for writing. So what I do is I relax, I lean back, and I just I start to imagine the story in my head, and I think, oh, what would be really cool to do in this? Now, some of you may also run into the same thing where you have the worries of the day in your head. And again, if that happens, I would suggest that you find something that is going to shift your emotions and shift your thoughts away from that, like music, what I use. And also writing down those issues, putting those into the story or the nonfiction or whatever you're writing. And you don't have to keep what you write. Actually, I think one of the best things about writing daily is you don't keep most of what you write. Maybe you do, but you don't give it to anybody else. You write for your own pure pleasure, and that actually helps you process through things as well. And eventually you do create this habit of writing. And one of the things that I think big writers always say is that you don't write when you just feel like writing. You actually you write because that's what you do. And that's why I think creativity is a habit. And that's why I think to be someone creative, you're not just basing it off the fact that you really like being creative. Instead of creating something when you feel like you are swept up in a feeling, a lot of feels there, you are doing it because you do it. And I think that people who constantly are creative daily in their lives, or just weekly maybe, they produce so much material that maybe they only use 20% of that material, right? They write and write and write. They use 20% of what they write or what they make as musicians, right? I told a friend of mine, I'm like, hey, why don't you just write a song a month? And honestly, like if you were a musician and you wrote a song a month, you don't have to record it. You could just record it on your phone so you have it available. You could always go back to those recordings. And what you could do is you could be like, oh, this is actually really good. Oh, I can adapt this in this way. Oh, I never thought about this. I could change this lyric or these lyrics, right? And you'd have so much material. You'd have 12 songs over the year, which is about the length of an album. And maybe over 2 or 3 years, you'd cut down those songs to like 3 or 4 a year that you like, and you'd have a whole entire album in 3 years that you could record if you wanted to, or you could just play, whatever. But yeah, someone who is constantly creating something. There's this quote, and I don't know the exact quotation of what it is, but it's essentially saying that. It's essentially saying that if you continue to try to do something, you're giving yourself more luck, right? Success is when like habit meets opportunity or something like that. So you are constantly doing something so that when an opportunity comes up, you're able to seize that opportunity. Well, if you are creating something as a habit, eventually you're going to run into a situation where you're swept up in that. You're swept up in that transcendent feeling of creating something, and you're writing down all the right words, but it wouldn't have happened unless you had been writing at the time, right? So that's what I've got for you. The logical fallacy of the week is appeal to probability. Appeal to probability, if I could talk, is you take something for granted because it probably will happen. So if you say, oh, this is the case, I'm making this argument because this is probably going to happen, that's the appeal to probability. Just because something is probably going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. A big example of this is saying, oh, the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Well, there isn't a certainty that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. Is there an extremely high probability? Yes, but it's not certain. So if you just use that as your argument, then that is the appeal to probability. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support me more, what I would ask you to do is that you go to iTunes and you leave a 5-star review. That is something that really, really helps me and helps push the podcast out to different people. And it's something that doesn't cost you much time at all. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. If you ever listen to this podcast and you have questions or you have topics you would like me to cover, you can send those to me and I'll look them over and I'll see which ones I think I can cover intelligently. And if you just want to reach out for anything at all, you can do that as well. Thanks for your time. My name is Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.